I mocked the poor man at my door. Then he saved my daughter's life. The rain was a relentless, drumming accusation against the windows of my sprawling suburban home. Each drop seemed to echo the self-satisfaction that had settled deep in my bones over the years. My life was a testament to hard work, to smart decisions, to the undeniable fact that I had earned this. The polished oak floors, the hushed hum of the expensive refrigerator, the framed degrees on the wall, they were all tangible proof of my ascendancy. I'd built this from nothing, clawing my way up from a childhood of scarcity, a past I rarely allowed myself to revisit, not because it was traumatic, but because it felt irrelevant, a stepping stone I'd long since discarded. My wife, Sarah, was out with friends. My daughter, Lily, was tucked away in her room, lost in the digital glow of her tablet, and I was left to the quiet contemplation of my own success. Then the doorbell rang. It was a jarring, insistent sound that broke the evening's carefully constructed peace. Annoyance pricked at me. Who would dare disturb my sanctuary at this hour, on a night like this? I peered through the peephole, my brow furrowing. A man stood on my porch, hunched against the downpour, his clothes dark and sodden, clinging to a frame that looked too thin to withstand the wind. His face was etched with a weariness that seemed older than his years, a stark contrast to the vibrant, almost smug contentment I felt within my own skin. He held a battered, empty bucket, a solicitor perhaps, or worse, someone selling something I didn't need, someone preying on the vulnerability of a storm. My immediate instinct was to ignore him, to let the rain wash him away, a silent, unspoken dismissal of his presence. My past had taught me the value of self-reliance, of not being a burden, and I had long ago compartmentalized that part of myself, believing I had transcended the need for such struggles. But the doorbell rang again, a little softer this time, almost a plea. A flicker of something, impatience perhaps, or a grudging sense of obligation, stirred within me. I opened the door a crack, the cold, damp air instantly invading the warmth of my home. He looked up, his eyes a startlingly clear blue against his weathered face, meeting mine. They held no resentment, no anger, just a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He gestured with his head towards the bucket. He was a painter, he explained, his voice a low rumble, raspy from the cold. He'd been working on a job across town, a long day, and the storm had caught him by surprise. He'd hoped I might have some spare paint, just a small amount, enough to finish a patch he'd promised to repair for an elderly neighbor before the weather turned. He spoke with a quiet dignity, a simple request delivered without expectation. My initial reaction was a surge of indignant superiority. Spare paint? He wanted my paint? The high-quality, specially mixed pigment I'd painstakingly selected for my own home's exterior touch-ups? The very idea was audacious. I saw him not as a fellow human being caught in a predicament, but as an imposition, a disruption to the order I had so carefully curated. The scarcity of my own upbringing, the years spent worrying about every penny, had bred in me a fierce possessiveness, a deep-seated fear of depletion. To give away something I had acquired through my own labor felt like a betrayal of that struggle. He was the embodiment of the very thing I had fought so hard to escape: need. And in that moment, my meticulously constructed moral edifice built on the bedrock of my own achievements felt unassailable. I saw his request as a test of my generosity, a test I was determined to fail. My response was sharp, cutting. I told him I had no spare paint, that I didn't keep such things lying around. I implied, with a dismissive wave of my hand, that he should have been better prepared, that the storm was his problem, not mine. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not disappointment, but perhaps a dawning understanding. He simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and turned to leave. The rain seemed to intensify as he walked away, blurring his figure against the already darkening landscape. I closed the door, the click of the latch a definitive punctuation mark on the encounter. I felt a brief, hollow satisfaction, a confirmation of my boundaries, my self-sufficiency. I told myself I had done the right thing, the practical thing. I had protected what was mine. I returned to my comfortable chair, the drumming rain now sounding less like an accusation and more like a soft, insistent whisper of something I couldn't quite decipher. The night continued, but a subtle shift had occurred, a hairline fracture in the glass of my carefully constructed reality, a crack I was, for the moment, entirely oblivious to. The cold I felt wasn't from the open door. It was a deeper, more insidious chill that began to seep into the edges of my carefully curated world. It was the chill of a decision made from a place of judgment, a choice that, in retrospect, revealed more about the flaws within me than the circumstances of the man I had turned away. My arrogance, I now realize, was a shield, a brittle defense mechanism built over years of striving, of proving myself. I had equated my material success with moral superiority, a dangerous and ultimately isolating equation. The man's quiet dignity, his simple request, had not been an imposition but an opportunity, a chance to connect, to offer a small kindness that might have eased his burden. Instead, I had chosen to reinforce the walls between us, to solidify my own isolation. I had seen his need, and in doing so, had highlighted my own profound lack of compassion. The rain continued its relentless rhythm, and with each beat, a new awareness began to dawn, a subtle but undeniable shift in my perspective, a first faint tremor of an ethical awakening that would soon shatter the complacency I had so carefully cultivated. Later that evening, a frantic energy crackled through the house. Lily, my daughter, had developed a sudden violent fever. Her breathing became shallow, her small body racked with tremors. Sarah, her face a mask of panic, was on the phone with emergency services, her voice strained and tight. The storm outside had escalated, the wind howling like a banshee, branches scraping against the glass with alarming force. The roads, I knew, would be treacherous, perhaps even impassable. The comforting solidity of my home suddenly felt like a fragile shell, utterly inadequate against the raw power of nature and the vulnerability of my child. The carefully constructed world I inhabited, the one I believed I controlled, was rapidly dissolving into chaos. My success, my wealth, my carefully guarded possessions, they were all utterly useless in this moment. All that mattered was Lily, her tiny, struggling breaths, and the terrifying uncertainty of what was to come. The paramedics arrived, their faces grim, their movements urgent. They worked quickly, expertly, their professionalism a stark contrast to the rising tide of my own fear. They needed to get Lily to the hospital, and fast, but the storm had taken its toll. A large oak tree, a victim of the gale, had fallen directly across the main road leading out of our neighborhood. It was a massive obstruction, a dark, impassable barrier. The paramedics conferred, their voices low and urgent, a knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. They spoke of detours, of delays, of the critical time Lily was losing. My mind raced, grasping for solutions, for the resources I usually commanded. But this was beyond money, beyond influence. This was a force of nature, indifferent to my status, my power, my desperate pleas. Then, a figure emerged from the swirling rain and darkness. It was the man from earlier, the one I had so readily dismissed. He was not alone. He stood with two other men, their faces determined, their movements coordinated. They were carrying saws, ropes, and heavy-duty tools. They had seen the fallen tree, had recognized the urgency of the situation, and had, without a word of complaint or a moment's hesitation, begun the arduous task of clearing the road. I watched, stunned, as they worked with a quiet efficiency, their efforts driven by a purpose that transcended their own comfort or safety. There was no fanfare, no expectation of reward, just a collective, unspoken commitment to helping. As they methodically cut through the thick trunk, I felt a profound and humbling realization wash over me. This man, whom I had judged and scorned, whom I had seen as a beggar at my gate, was now the unlikely savior, the embodiment of the very compassion I had so readily denied. His actions spoke louder than any words, his quiet determination a stark rebuke to my earlier callousness. He was not merely clearing a road, he was clearing a path for my daughter's survival, a path I had, in my arrogance, tried to block. The cold I had felt earlier was now replaced by a searing heat, the heat of shame, of regret, of a dawning understanding of my own moral failing. The rain, which had seemed like an accusation earlier, now felt like a cleansing, washing away the layers of my self-deception. The road was cleared. The paramedics were able to proceed, Lily safely in their care. As they drove away, their siren a fading lament in the storm, I stood there, soaked to the bone, watching the man and his companions pack up their tools. He looked towards me, not with triumph, but with a quiet understanding that seemed to penetrate to my very core. There was no recrimination in his gaze, only a silent acknowledgement of the shared human experience, of the unexpected turns life could take, of the profound interconnectedness that bound us all. He offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that held more weight and meaning than any grand pronouncement. He then turned and disappeared back into the downpour, leaving me standing alone, the echoes of his kindness a stark contrast to the emptiness of my earlier judgment. The hospital was a sterile, impersonal space, but for the first time I felt truly present, truly aware of the fragility of life and the immense value of every moment. Lily, thankfully, began to recover. The fever broke, her breathing stabilized, and the doctors assured us she would be fine, but the experience had irrevocably altered me. I found myself replaying the encounter at my door, the man's weary eyes, his simple request, my own curt dismissal. The memory was no longer just an embarrassment, it was a catalyst. I saw the stark contrast between his selfless act and my own self-serving behavior. He, who had so little, had given so much. I, who had so much, had given nothing but disdain. The polished floors and framed degrees of my home now seemed hollow, meaningless. My true wealth, I began to understand, lay not in what I possessed, but in how I treated others, especially those in need. The next morning, the sun was tentatively breaking through the clouds, casting a pale, watery light on the sodden landscape. I drove back to the site of the fallen tree. The debris had been mostly cleared, but a few larger branches still lay scattered. I found the man sitting on a damp, overturned bucket near the roadside, quietly cleaning his tools. He looked up as I approached, a flicker of surprise in his clear blue eyes. I didn't know what I would say, how I would articulate the profound shift that had occurred within me. I simply walked over and offered him the bucket I had so foolishly guarded the night before, a brand new, sturdy one I had purchased on impulse. I then reached into my wallet, not to offer payment, but to give him a significant sum of money, far more than he could possibly have earned in a week. I didn't do it out of obligation, but out of a deep, heartfelt need to acknowledge his humanity, his kindness, and my own profound error. He looked at the bucket, then at the money, and finally back at me. His expression was unreadable for a moment, and then a slow, gentle smile spread across his face. He didn't accept the money immediately. Instead, he stood and extended his hand. I took it, and in that simple handshake, a silent understanding passed between us. He had offered me a gift the night before, a gift of opportunity, and I had refused it. Today, I was trying to offer him a gift, an apology, a gesture of atonement. He accepted the money, not with gratitude, but with a quiet dignity that mirrored his demeanor the previous night. He then picked up the new bucket, tested its weight, and nodded. He didn't offer platitudes or forgiveness. He simply said, "The road is clear now," and in those few words, he acknowledged the completion of a circle, the resolution of a debt that had been far more significant than I had initially realized. I drove home, the rising sun painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. The world looked different, sharper, more vibrant. The rain had washed away more than just the mud and debris. It had washed away the layers of my own prejudice and arrogance. The encounter had been unexpected, a disruption to my carefully ordered life, but it had also been a profound gift, a painful but necessary awakening. I had been so focused on building my own success, on protecting my own achievements, that I had forgotten the fundamental truth of our shared humanity. The man at my door, the stranger I had so readily dismissed, had reminded me that true wealth lies not in what we accumulate, but in how we connect, in the empathy we extend, in the kindness we offer, even when it costs us something. The memory of his weary eyes, the rain-soaked clothes, and the simple plea for paint was no longer a source of shame, but a powerful, indelible reminder. It was a testament to the fact that even the most hardened hearts can be softened, that the most entrenched beliefs can be challenged, and that true growth often comes not from within our comfort zones, but from the unexpected encounters that force us to confront our own limitations. I had mocked the poor man at my door, blinded by my own perceived superiority, and in doing so, I had nearly lost everything that truly mattered. His selfless act, born from a place of deep human decency, had not only saved my daughter's life, but had also, in a far more profound and lasting way, saved my soul. The lesson, etched into my being by the storm and the kindness of a stranger, was simple and absolute. True prosperity is measured not by what we hold, but by what we are willing to share. The lingering chill in the air, even as the sun began to assert its dominance, was a physical manifestation of the internal dissonance I was experiencing. My encounter with the man, the sheer, unvarnished contrast between his magnanimity and my own parsimony, had cracked the foundation of my self-perception. It wasn't just about a missed opportunity for kindness, it was a profound exposure of a deeply ingrained flaw, the belief that empathy was a luxury, an expendable commodity I could afford to dispense with once I had achieved a certain level of security. I had operated under the assumption that compassion was a weakness, a vulnerability that had no place in the ruthless arena of personal advancement. Now, however, the sheer, unthinking immediacy of his actions, his willingness to brave the storm, to offer his meager resources, to contribute to the well-being of a stranger, presented a stark counterpoint to my own carefully calculated self-interest. Consider the subtle, almost imperceptible ways in which this self-imposed emotional austerity had manifested in my life prior to that night. I'd always prided myself on my objectivity, my ability to make rational decisions devoid of sentimentality. This translated into a professional demeanor that was efficient, yes, but also distant, unyielding. Colleagues were resources, clients were transactions, and personal relationships, while cherished, were often approached with a similar detached pragmatism. I'd never considered that this calculated detachment, this deliberate sidestepping of emotional engagement, might be a form of spiritual poverty. It was a blindness to the intricate tapestry of human connection, a failure to recognize that genuine strength often lies not in isolation, but in the capacity for shared vulnerability and mutual support. The man's simple act of offering what little he had was not a sign of weakness, but an expression of a fundamental human strength I had long since suppressed within myself. Furthermore, the incident underscored the inherent fallacy of equating material possessions with moral fortitude. My home, my cars, my financial portfolio, these were the metrics by which I had measured my success, and by extension, my worth. Yet, in the face of Lily's crisis, these tangible assets proved utterly impotent. It was the intangible qualities, the courage of the paramedics, the collaborative spirit of the men who cleared the road, and most importantly, the unbidden compassion of the stranger, that ultimately made the difference. This stark realization forced me to confront the shallow nature of my previous value system. I had been so consumed with acquiring and protecting external markers of success that I had neglected the cultivation of the internal qualities that truly define a person. The man at my door, with his worn clothes and empty bucket, possessed a richness of character that far surpassed my own material abundance. Building on this, the experience illuminated the destructive nature of judgment, particularly when it stems from a place of privilege. My immediate assumption that the man was a supplicant, an imposition, a drain on my resources, was a direct product of my own elevated position. I had judged him based on his outward appearance, his perceived lack, rather than on his intrinsic worth as a human being. This tendency to categorize and dismiss others based on superficial criteria is a subtle but pervasive form of moral corruption. It creates an us versus them mentality, eroding the very foundations of community and shared responsibility. The man's subsequent actions served as a powerful rebuke to my prejudice, demonstrating that true nobility resides not in one's circumstances, but in one's character and actions, regardless of social standing. Consequently, The incident began a process of reevaluating my understanding of strength. I had always associated strength with stoicism, with self-reliance, with the ability to weather any storm alone. The man's resilience, however, was not born of isolation, but of community, of a willingness to engage with and support others. His strength was in his connection, his ability to perceive a need and act upon it, even at personal inconvenience. This offered a radical new perspective, that true strength is not the absence of reliance, but the capacity for interdependence. It is the willingness to both offer and accept help, to recognize that our individual well-being is inextricably linked to the well-being of those around us. My previous definition of strength, I now saw, was not only flawed, but also deeply isolating. Another crucial layer to this unfolding revelation was the understanding that empathy is not merely an emotion, but an active choice, a practice that requires conscious cultivation. It's easy to feel sympathy for someone in dire straits, but to actively step into their shoes, to understand their perspective and respond with genuine care, requires a deliberate effort. The man's willingness to help an elderly neighbor, even after a long, arduous day, exemplified this active empathy. It wasn't a passive feeling, it was a committed action. My own failure to extend that same courtesy, even in a far less demanding situation, highlighted how my own emotional muscles had atrophied from disuse. The path forward, I was beginning to grasp, involved not just acknowledging my past failings, but actively practicing the very virtues I had so carelessly neglected. The weight of my past arrogance, now amplified by the stark reality of my daughter's near tragedy, began to manifest in a profound reevaluation of my professional life. My success, once a source of unassailable pride, now felt tainted, built on a foundation of an emotional deficit I had actively cultivated. I had always operated with a meticulous, almost clinical detachment, viewing colleagues as cogs in a machine, their personal struggles an inconvenient distraction from the pursuit of efficiency and profit. My decisions, though often strategically sound, lacked a crucial human element. I had optimized processes, but neglected the very people who executed them. This realization was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow, dawning awareness, like the gradual clearing of a fog bank revealing a landscape I had never truly seen. I started to notice the subtle cues I had previously ignored, the slumped shoulders of an overworked junior associate, the strained smile of a team member juggling family emergencies, the quiet anxieties that simmered beneath the surface of polite workplace interactions. Furthermore, this internal recalibration extended to my approach to problem solving. Previously, my default was to seek the most efficient, often the most impersonal solution. If a project faltered, my first instinct was to identify the bottleneck, the faulty component, and address it directly, often without considering the human factors at play. Now, I found myself pausing, considering the ripple effects of any decision. How would this impact morale? What unforeseen burdens might it place on individuals? I began to understand that true innovation and sustained success were not solely the product of brilliant strategy, but also of a supportive, empathetic environment where individuals felt valued and understood. This shift was not about abandoning logic. It was about integrating it with a deeper understanding of human needs and motivations. Consider how this new perspective might apply when you're tasked with streamlining a workflow. Instead of merely automating a task, you now consider how that automation might affect the job security or workload of the person currently performing it, seeking a solution that enhances efficiency without sacrificing human dignity. Conversely, my interactions with clients also underwent a transformation. My previous approach had been transactional, focused on closing the deal, on maximizing immediate gain. I had viewed client relationships as a series of negotiations, each interaction a strategic maneuver. Now, I began to see the individuals behind the corporate facades, recognizing their own pressures, their own aspirations, and their own vulnerabilities. This led to a more collaborative, trust-based approach. Instead of simply presenting solutions, I started asking more questions, listening more intently, and seeking to understand their underlying needs and long-term goals. This deeper engagement, while sometimes more time-consuming, fostered stronger, more resilient partnerships built on mutual respect and genuine understanding. Rather than on fleeting expediency, it was about building bridges, not just closing transactions. Another crucial layer to this evolving perspective was the recognition that vulnerability, far from being a weakness, could be a source of profound connection and strength. My lifelong habit of projecting an image of unwavering competence and control had, in retrospect, created a barrier between myself and others. By refusing to reveal any hint of my own struggles or uncertainties, I had inadvertently discouraged others from doing the same, fostering an environment where emotional honesty was implicitly discouraged. The ordeal with Lily, however, had shattered that facade. In my fear and desperation, I had been raw, exposed, and in that vulnerability, I had experienced a deeper connection with Sarah, with the paramedics, and even, in a strange, indirect way, with the man I had wronged. This realization prompted a conscious effort to be more open, to share not just my successes, but also my challenges, my doubts, and my learning curves. Now, when faced with a complex professional challenge, I might openly admit to the team that I'm exploring several avenues and am open to their input, creating a collaborative space for shared problem solving rather than a solitary burden. The implications of this shift were far-reaching, touching every aspect of my life. It was a slow, often uncomfortable process, shedding decades of ingrained habits and beliefs. Yet, with each small step, a more patient conversation with an employee, a more empathetic response to a client's concern, a more open admission of my own limitations, the world around me began to change, and more importantly, I began to change with it. The sterile efficiency I had once prized was gradually being infused with a warmth, a depth, and a richness that had been conspicuously absent. It was the dawning understanding that true mastery, in life as in business, is not about control and isolation, but about connection and collaboration. The profound shift in my perspective wasn't confined to my professional life. It began to permeate my personal interactions in ways I hadn't anticipated. My relationship with Sarah, once a partnership built on shared goals and mutual respect, had, over time, settled into a comfortable, yet perhaps too predictable routine. We had become adept at navigating each other's lives with minimal friction, a skill honed through years of shared history. However, this efficiency had, inadvertently, begun to eclipse genuine emotional attunement. We communicated, certainly, but often at a surface level, managing logistics rather than delving into the deeper currents of our emotional landscapes. The incident with Lily, and the subsequent unraveling of my carefully constructed worldview, compelled me to re-examine this dynamic. I started to recognize that the same detachment I had applied in my professional dealings had, to some extent, seeped into my most intimate relationship. Consider how this manifests in everyday life. Previously, if Sarah mentioned a challenging day at her book club, my response might have been a pragmatic, "Well, try to get some rest tonight." Now, however, I found myself digging deeper. I'd inquire about the specific dynamics, the personalities involved, the underlying tensions she might be experiencing. It wasn't about offering solutions, but about demonstrating a genuine interest in her internal world, acknowledging the validity of her feelings, whatever they might be. This involved not just listening to her words, but actively observing her body language, the subtle shifts in her tone, the unspoken emotions that often lie beneath the surface of casual conversation. This deeper engagement fostered a renewed sense of intimacy, a feeling of being truly seen and heard, which in turn strengthened the foundation of our partnership. Furthermore, my interactions with Lily herself underwent a significant transformation. Before, my paternal role had been largely defined by providing for her needs, ensuring her safety, and guiding her academic progress. While filled with love, this approach often lacked a crucial element of emotional resonance. I was the provider, the protector, the disciplinarian, but perhaps not always the confidant. The brush with mortality had starkly illustrated the ephemeral nature of life and the paramount importance of cherishing every moment. This realization spurred a conscious effort to cultivate a more emotionally open and responsive relationship with her. Instead of simply asking about her day, I began to inquire about her feelings, her friendships, her burgeoning sense of self. I made a deliberate effort to be present, not just physically, but emotionally, creating space for her to express her joys, her fears, and her confusions without judgment. Imagine, for instance, Lily returning from school upset about a perceived slight from a friend. My prior instinct might have been to offer a quick reassurance, perhaps even a mild reprimand of the friend. Now, however, I'd sit with her, listen intently to her narrative, validate her feelings of hurt or anger, and explore the situation from multiple perspectives. This wasn't about condoning unkindness, but about fostering her emotional intelligence, teaching her to process complex social dynamics and develop her own capacity for empathy. It was about building a reservoir of trust, ensuring she knew that her emotional well-being was as important to me as her physical safety or academic achievements. This approach cultivated a deeper bond, one where she felt safe to be vulnerable and authentic, knowing she had a supportive, emotionally attuned presence in her corner. The journey from that moment has been one of continuous unfolding. It's not a destination reached, but a path being walked, each step a conscious choice to engage with the world from a place of greater empathy and understanding. The impulse to judge, once so automatic, is now met with a pause, a moment of reflection, a conscious effort to consider the unseen currents that shape another's life. The focus has shifted from measuring individual merit by external markers to appreciating the diverse tapestry of human capability, recognizing that competence manifests in countless forms, often in the quiet, unheralded acts of everyday kindness. This ongoing process is not about erasing the past, but about integrating its lessons, allowing them to inform a more compassionate and connected future. The true practice begins now, in the quiet moments, in the everyday interactions, in the conscious choice to see the humanity in every face, a reminder that the greatest wealth is not what we hold, but what we are willing to give.